McDonald's in Seoul, Korea. Food choices, identity, and nationalism. By Sang-mi Bak. Now, if you look at Korean history, it has a history very tragic, full of colonization. Hundreds of years, Koreans had to show fealty by giving food and jewels to Chinese royalty. They were invaded by pirates, multiple raids from neighbors. Also, the intense War II Japanese colonization, which where they were taken over by the country of Japan, forced to eat Japanese food, forced to change their names into Japanese, and forced to actually learn Japanese and not learn Korean. So, of course, a very brutal colonization that Japan instituted, as well as taking away 400,000 comfort women, which they stole 90% from Korea. These were women that were children and young women that were taken forcefully against their will and tricked, and they were forced to be sex slaves for Japanese imperial soldiers and also regular soldiers. This is an ongoing issue, and Korea is not healed from this war too. Of course, a lot of these comfort women were murdered at the end of the war, and so again, a huge gaping hole in Korean history and society that's ongoing today. And of course, one could argue the neocolonialism that's happening now with the U.S. Military force in South Korea. Now, the past is not the past. So, what year did the Korean McDonald's come and open in Korea? I would like you to look that up. Now, I talked about how there's lots of colonization kind of history ongoing now. Now, in Korea, there's still a debate over colonization. Yes, being taken over. Again, look at their history. They've been taken over by several different entities, had a very traumatizing past that's ongoing. And so when an American force tries to come into Korea, think about the reaction. Weren't they just forced to eat Japanese food? Weren't they forced to change their names to Japanese? Weren't they forced to do all these things and actually to lose their Korean identity? Again, this is a very terrible history. So again, when McDonald's comes, it's not coming to this empty space. It's coming to a traumatized space where people were forced to eat another culture. So if there is a debate on this, the debate would be on, should we eat American food? Because again, could be seen as a force of colonization. Now in Korea, rice represents who? Well, rice represents Koreans. Now, one could also argue kimchi is a global representation of Korea. So rice is Korean culture. Now, what does the hamburger represent culturally? Now, the hamburger represents the United States. So the hamburger represents the United States, and that is again United States going into Korea where they were previously forced to eat food. So again, lots of conflict when McDonald's came to Korea. Now, a lot of Korean McDonald's employees believe that McDonald's is local now. It's good because it actually donates to charity. So that's what it happened later on, years later. But when it first came, there's a lot of kind of a debate in the newspapers, like, should we have McDonald's? Should we be nationalistic and eat our own Korean food? Now, a lot of women like McDonald's because why? Well, again, they can buy their own food. They can bring their children. It's safe, has a children's area, and again, not expensive. And it's a place where you can hang out, have a coffee, and no one really hassles you. Again, a lot of Korean restaurants are very formal. And so you can't do that to spend all day in McDonald's, but you can do it here. And it's very nice and very clean and very safe. Now, originally, Koreans shunned McDonald's because they thought of it as American imperialism. Now let's wrap our brain around them. Yes, they thought of McDonald's as American imperialism because it was a different culture coming in, and remember, in the past they were forced to eat Japanese food. So they actually did not want to eat it because they thought it was a way of colonizing them.